a topic that I'm really passionate about. And that topic is older adult suicide. So we're going to be looking at this from a cross-cultural and a cross-national perspective. What that means is that we're basically going to be looking at suicide stats in this age population around the world, and we're going to be putting it into a graph and seeing if there's any sort of trends, and hopefully we can find something that could be relevant and could potentially help the world in this category. So without further ado, let's get into it. So let's get some definitions and context first. We're going to be defining older adult as anyone over the age of 45, and the only reason for that is because within this study we look at a lot of suicide stats, and a lot of organizations that actually release that data publicly, such as the World Health Organization, release them in increments of 10, and they stop at age 45. So like WHO will actually release those stats, and they'll start at like birth to age 10, age 10 to 20, age 20 to 30, so on until age 45. After age 45, they'll categorize them all into one giant age group. So if we, I know, right? So if we sort of embrace that standard, we can find just so many more statistics that way. And also, we're going to be defining suicide in a very specific way. If you look to the right of me, that man is Emil Durkheim. He's one of the very first founders of sociology, and he's actually one of the very first people to ever publish anything regarding suicide in like history of like everything. He's a really smart guy, really awesome guy. Anyways, back in the late 1800s, he published a book on suicide. He looked at different religions and how it affects it, and he defined suicide in a very specific way. He defined suicide as this sort of direct and indirect manner, where he equivocated a person taking their life directly by stabbing themselves. He believed that to be 100% equivalent to someone taking their own lives but not eating for a prolonged period of time. So as long as the perpetrator knew exactly about the consequences they were getting themselves into. So basically he believed that as long as someone knew what they were doing, they knew they were committing suicide, it didn't matter the way they went about it. He classified that whole general area as suicide. And that's going to be important for the rest of this study. And we're also going to be talking about his theory of suicide. He categorized suicide into 4 main categories, 2 of which aren't really relevant, but the other 2 we're going to be talking about a lot. And those types of suicide are egoistic suicide and altruistic suicide. So let's define those 2. Egoistic suicide is what occurs from being way too disintegrated from society. It's what occurs from not having any social ties, not having any social bonds, not having family, or especially a job. Those are the sort of types of things that bring us together into society. And Emil Durkheim actually believed that society gave us a huge purpose in life. He believed it made us get up every day. He believed it gave us a purpose. So he believed that if we didn't have that in our lives, we would be more likely to take our own life. And if we did, it'd be known as an egoistic suicide. The second type of suicide we're going to be talking about is altruistic suicide, the complete opposite of what I just mentioned. Altruistic suicide is what occurs when you're way too ingrained into a society, so much so that you would take your own life for it. A really good example of this are the kamikaze fighter pilots during World War II. In case we don't know, the kamikaze were a group of pilots during World War II in Japan that would actually fly their planes into the enemy with themselves still being in the plane. So they would take their own life just to be able to fight the enemy. They cared so much about their country, they were so ingrained into their military and their country and their family that they would take their own life for it. So that's a really good example of altruistic suicide. Sort of taking your life for the better good of your community and your country. So just to sort of recap that, egoistic suicide is what occurs from individualism, and altruistic suicide occurs from collectivism. So moving on to my literature review. While I was looking at different papers regarding older adult suicide, there were generally 2 types of trends that I found. And I'm going to be talking about those specifically. One of them is really well exemplified by this quote down here. As I kept on reading different papers, it was really the same things that came up. One of which was that this is a huge problem, and we don't talk about it very much. From this quote here, this is from a paper published in 2011. They say that it's generally getting better in the US, but again, this is from 2011, and if we look at statistics that were released by the Center for Disease Control in 2016, this is specifically for females, but I'll show you the male part in a second. If we look at, and by the way, this is from 2016, if we look at the contrast between these 2 bars, the darker shade of green is data from 1999, and the lighter shade of green is data from 2016. in general, you can see that the suicide rates for just about everyone is increasing, but specifically for our age group of 45 and above, it's skyrocketed. It's getting bigger. This is something we need to talk about. And the same thing just happens with males. As you can see here, the darker shade of blue is 1999, and the lighter shade of blue is 2014. Again, it's data that's a little more recent. So as you can see here, in general, it's increasing, and even something else we want to notice here is that as you get older, you're a lot more likely to take your own life, and this is what this data is sort of showing. For males, the most affected group is 75 and above, but that still falls into our category of 45 and above. So this is something we should really talk about. Another thing that came up during my literature review was that we use a little too much psychology in practice as opposed to sociology. That needs to sort of change. Marston and Powell are two researchers at the University of Northern Carolina, in which they found that whenever psychiatrists are actually trying to find out whether people are thinking about taking their own life, especially older adults, they would rely a little more on psychological tactics to try to find that out, such as like interpersonal theory and a bunch of other theories in psychology. And so he believed that if we can integrate stuff like those theories of suicide I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, that maybe we can have some sort of change and we can increase our likelihood of finding out whether someone wants to take their own life, and maybe we can improve those suicide stats that I showed you earlier. And that's sort of where my research comes in. We want to put sociology into psychiatry, but there hasn't been too much data or research in that area. So what does sociology in psychiatry and sort of finding out suicide through that look like? And that sort of brings me to my research. If you remember those theories of suicide I mentioned earlier, there's suicide that occurs from extreme individualism and extreme collectivism. I kind of wanted to search that up in the world, and I wanted to see if I applied those theories into the real life, if it would work out, and we would be able to predict those. So my hypothesis is countries with a high amount of individualism have higher rates of older adult suicide than countries with a lower amount of individualism. What I'm basically saying here is that as we have more individualism in a country, the older adult suicide rate will be higher in those countries as well. And that kind of makes sense if we think about this theories from earlier. So how are we going to be measuring individualism? It's not really tangible. So we're going to be using for this research Hofstede's individuality scale. Pretty smart guy, he's a social psychologist from today, he's actually still around. He basically looked at stuff like literature. He looked at how much a country used the words I versus we. He also looked at family ties, whether it was nuclear, which means that it's the immediate family, or if it was more extended and like we had more generations in the household. He looked at all these different factors to try to decide whether a country was more individualistic or collectivist. And he basically put a bunch of countries on a scale of 0 to 120, 120 being the highest amount of individualism that you can have, and 0 being the most collectivist you can get. For some scale, the highest country on this list was the United States with 91 points, meaning we're the most individualistic country on a scale, again from his perspective. And the lowest country on there is Guatemala with 6 points, meaning that that's the most collectivist country he found. So that's what we're going to be kind of using. So methodology, what did I actually do? I found statistics for different countries and I put them all into a graph, and I also put their ranking of individualism on that graph, so we can try to find any sort of correlation between individualism and older adult suicide. And hopefully we can't find any correlation, so we can try to convince psychiatrists to sort of take sociology into consideration. So results. I looked at 6 different countries, and at first I wasn't too happy with this graph, because as you can see here, by the way, these points correlate to how many points they got on the scale of individualism. So I thought that the highest would be the United States, since we're the highest on the list. We have 91 points, yet we have less older adult suicide than countries like South Korea or Japan. And so at first I'm wondering why this was the reason. But it sort of started making sense once I started looking into those countries. The very first outlier that came out on this chart was Japan. And so I started looking into Japan's culture and their whole life there. And I started to see exactly what was going on. I'd like to introduce you all to Mr. Yamada. He's going to be helping me here and sort of help us figure out why that was on there. Mr. Yamada is a retired nuclear engineer who used to work at the Fukushima site before it melted down. And he's actually leading a group of volunteers now to go clean up the area. And so here's some of the quotes that CNN got from interviewing these guys called the Suicide Corps. These are people that are retired engineers that are going on site, a site that's full of nuclear radiation, by the way. And they're fully working there, 100%, and they know exactly what they're getting themselves into. If you read some of these quotes, you can clearly see that they know exactly what they're doing. First, they're talking about how they're older, so it's completely fine that they work there because their cells multiply at a slower rate than younger people. So it's 100% fine that they're killing themselves, but they can keep doing this because they're older. Someone else justifies their work as the fact that their generation was the generation that promoted power plants, so it's completely fine that they do that. If we kind of think back to the theories from the beginning of this presentation, there was this thing called indirect suicide in which you're committing suicide at a slower rate, but you know exactly what you're doing. And this sounds a little more like altruistic suicide too, because they're doing it not for themselves, but rather for a more communal good. And so if we go back to these results, they make a lot more sense now. Japan is all the way up there with less individualism, more collectivism, but they also have more suicide rates because of altruistic suicide. So my conclusion really is that the data and research was somewhat consistent, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go a little faster. But in general, in case I didn't come out as 100% accurate, I still want you to take away the fact that we do have a problem of suicide in this older population in the United States. And if you remember anything, it's the fact that our problem isn't collectivism. Our problem is individualism. Although we don't have the highest rates in the world, we do have significantly higher rates among the world. And this whole research was motivated by the fact that I had a close relative become diagnosed with depression. He's an older adult, never spoke to him too much. So if you all could please do me a favor once you leave this room and speak with someone you haven't spoken to in a while. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much. Indirect way?
Either or.
Either or.
Like an Alzheimer's patient who refuses to eat because they don't understand, or someone with schizophrenia who tries to keep their life because they don't idea.
Yeah, so that's really difficult because it wouldn't really fall into this type of suicide because the suicide was they know exactly what they're doing and they're committing it. Whereas if they have a mental illness or they are doing it like against their will, it's not really suicide. It's more of something else, some external factor that's causing that.
And the reason I ask that is because a lot of suicide that happens in nursing homes is because of those kinds of factors like dementia or schizophrenia. So now are those counted into the suicide rates that the United States is seeing?
I believe not for the ones I had up here, but I'm not 100% sure. So that'd be interesting to factor in. Thank you. Sorry, I think he had his hand
Sure.
first.
I just wanted to ask what you thought if you found out there was in the chart that you had in the male suicide rates, it jumped pretty significantly from the 10 to 15, like 15 to 25. There was a huge jump there. I was just wondering if you happen to know why that might have been.
15 to 25.
I felt like the age range, there was a huge increase. So the 10 to 14 and then the 15 to 24, there was just a huge increase. I was just wondering
that's right.
why that might have been.
Shoot, I remember this too. I remember thinking that exact thing. I believe it's because they don't keep track as much when they're younger, and they do once they're older. I remember specifically finding that on the internet. I'm sorry, I can't remember it. Yeah.
So it's very interesting, that idea of the altruistic, so it seems like in the Japanese and Korean there's, maybe something related to the community, or sort of in general. But I guess the other thing you wonder about is sometimes even within individual families, and maybe this goes with the individualistic societies that is like, oh, I'm a burden on my family. So it's not,
Exactly.
so whether that would count as altruistic, not just, oh, I'm willing to do something good for my country, but more just, I don't want to be a burden on my family, and
That's
if
right.
that kind of falls into that altruistic and they
That's
go
a
with the individual
huge
one.
part of altruistic suicide. And I wanted to go even more in depth on that, because that's, there's another story in there, but I ran out of time. I was like at 1 minute. Yeah, but yeah, that's a huge portion of altruistic suicide. Taking a good portion of older adults do take their lives because of that burden feeling from their family.
And this is the last question.
You said in addition that we can make a contribution, like contacting family members. But I saw that in your conclusion you said social programs. So what sort of social programs do you think would work to like decrease the suicide rates for older adults?
Yeah, so I put that in there because there has been some talk in government about starting social programs to sort of fight this. Like I said, our problem isn't collective suicide, it's individualistic, so egoistic, which means that older people have less of those social ties, maybe they're not as much in contact with their family. So there has been talk about making artificial jobs to keep them ingrained in the society in some sort of fashion, which would be pretty cool actually.